We're now going to create an autumn scene, and we're going to cover a couple of different techniques for ecosystems and lighting, also modifying plant species. So the first thing I want to do is, instead of using and continuously using the spectral model, I'm going to use Hdri lighting, so environment mapping, and create a backdrop for the scene that will render a lot quicker while we're working on it, and if we need to later, we can switch it back to a spectral to get a little bit of better quality. So I'm going to start with a procedural terrain, and if we go ahead and right-click, edit the object, I'm going to turn off the Zero Edges mode, move over into the Procedural tab, right-click on the Procedural, edit the function, and I just want to create some distant, smoother hills, and I'm going to delete that seed. Just clicking and hitting delete on the keyboard, select this simple fractal that we have as the default, and instead of using a simple fractal, I'm going to use a basic repeater, which is more of an advanced noise node. I'm going to take our Perlin noise that we have set up as a value and switch it over to gradient, which will give us a lot less of the sharper creases that are part of the value noise. And then I can just decrease the wavelength to 0.5 on the X, Y, and Z. Click OK, and OK again. And now I want to make this scale out. So using the size gizmo with global mode, bringing down the Z-axis, and then increasing the overall size. And what I want to do is place the camera in the center of this, and just have some distant hills that will cover up the horizon. So we're going to move over to switch to the 4 viewport mode, grab the camera, switch to the move gizmo, and just move the main camera to just around the center of the terrain, looking for more of a dip in where the hills are. And we can take a look in the main camera view, just kind of rotate around, and see that we've got a nice distribution of these hills. So what I need is a grass material. So I'm going to select this procedural terrain. We can load in a material, and I'm going to include my modified grass material, so you'll be able to load that in from the project content folder from the training. This is grass native changed, and I'm going to edit the material, change the overall color, and just move a little bit over to the left into more of the yellow range. Because we're going to have an autumn scene, we want more of a yellow grass look, like it's starting to go dormant. Make a few changes to the atmosphere. I'm going to go to Atmosphere, Atmosphere Editor, first going into the Sun tab, and just modifying, bringing the pitch of the sun up slightly, and changing the size of the sun to be much lower. Reducing it, it'll show as 0%, but the slider is an indication of the actual size. If we bring it down all the way, it's still going to say 0, but the size of the sun will change. So just a very small amount, and reduce the size of the corona. Something a little bit smaller. If we move over to the Sky, Fog, and Haze tab, I'm going to change the sky color to something a little more gray. And the easiest way to do that, on the left we have the saturation slider. So I can just move the saturation down a little, make it a little more gray. And we can also reduce the sky density to darken up the sky. I'm going to add a little bit of fog, just around 10%. Increase our scattering to just under 0.8 or around 0.8, and add a little bit of glow. The aerial perspective we can adjust to kind of fill in some of those mounds in the back. And I want to add in a cloud layer. I'm going to use the Puffy Cumulus preset under Spectral 2. Click OK. And reduce the cover amount so that we just have some very small cloud patches. So around, let's go ahead and type in a value of 40%, which should be good. And under the Light tab, I'm going to select Global Illumination. Actually, for this, we'll go ahead just to make the render a little quicker. Use Global Ambience. It's not going to make a huge difference on this type of a scene at the moment. So sticking with that should be alright. What I also want to do is modify the haze color slightly. So I'm going to right-click, edit the color for the haze color. And now I'm going to pick in more of the purple-red range and start to bring up the saturation a little so that the haze in the background is a little more of a purple color. And that'll be a little more interesting of a sky. We can see in the preview render how this is going to look. A nice little purple in the back, more of a gray sky. I am going to reduce the clouds just a little, taking that cover amount and bringing it down to 35%. And now we'll just see very small patches of cloud. And now it's going to refresh the OpenGL. If you're making a lot of changes to the atmosphere, I do suggest that you turn off the OpenGL previewing for clouds, because the constant updating for every single change is going to be problematic and slow down your system a little. And now I'm going to set this up for a spherical render. And what I want to do is adjust the camera to make sure that it's level. So we're going to select the camera, move over to the Numerics tab, go to the Rotation and Orientation, which is the second tab down on the left for Position, Orientation, Scale, Skew, which is called Twist, and then the Pivot. So under Orientation, make sure the pitch is set to 90, and the yaw isn't really going to matter. If you need to have an exact match to where your sunlight is in the current position, then you may need to set this value to around 45. I'm just going to be manually matching the sun to the placement of the sun once we load in the image, so this should be fine. Just as long as the pitch is set to 90 so that the horizon is level, that's all we really need to worry about. If we right-click on the camera up at the top, we can bring up the render options, and what I want to do, render to screen, use just the final mode. Like I said, this is really more of a preview. If we want a definite final render from this, or a higher quality render, you're going to need to render out a much higher resolution than I'm going to be doing right now. We do want to check on the panoramic view. So this is the panoramic rendering mode. You can see a preview of that in the main camera preview, but we also want to use the spherical render, which is going to give us a good HDRI map we can use, and a spherical type map for the scene. Now, the pixel resolution is defined by the panoramic angle. As you can see under aspect ratio, it is grayed out. And I'm just going to render this at a lower resolution, just using 2400 by 1200. So this is really more of a preview. I can switch it back to a spectral when I'm done, or if you're going to be creating any sort of animation, you want something a little quicker, so you don't have to render the sky out for every single frame. You're definitely going to need a much higher resolution, probably 6K. So you could type in a value of 6000, and it should adjust our other amount. It looks like it's not at the moment. So it would be 6000 by 3000. Could be pretty decent if you're going to be using larger render frames. HD or film, then you're going to need something probably a little bit higher. But this option does work better than the File Export Sky option. You can see the Export Sky because it may not use all of the cores on your system. So I'm just going to do 2400 by 1200, click OK, and we can render this out. Now, I already rendered this, so what I'm just going to do is just to show what's going to happen once it's finished rendering, create something very small just to demonstrate what to do when to save. So I'll render this really small, and then once the render is finished, you're going to have your Z-depth, your alpha, and your color. If you're going to be modifying this image at all, then you want to make sure you're saving out all of these channels. But what I want to do is select the color and click the Save Displayed Picture icon. And now we can choose the format. I'm going to be using the EXR format. If we go to Options, we want to make sure that Use Alpha is turned off. Otherwise, the render is just going to be white. So if you're going to be separating the different channels, just make sure that Use Alpha is off in this case. And then you can save out the sky. You can also render to disk. If you right mouse click on the render settings, instead of rendering to the screen, you can save a render to the disk, and then choose your file format ahead of time and save that out. So it's a good idea to save your scene at this point and have a version to come back to with the sky render and the backdrop. I'm going to go ahead and now work on the alternate version, which is deleting the terrain and changing over the atmosphere. So I'm going to go ahead and save this out as a different file, just giving it another version name so that any modifications I make aren't going to affect that other file. I'm going to turn off the panoramic and spherical render. And then we can go up to Atmosphere, Atmosphere Editor, and under the Atmosphere model, we're no longer using the spectral mode. What we can do is switch over to the Environment Mapping mode. Now under the Effects tab that shows up, we have an environment map, which will be the HDRI. So we can choose to load in that image. And I created a couple of different versions. I'm going to go ahead and load in one of my images. And it's going to ask if we'd automatically like to set up the scene for HDRI lighting. I'm going to click yes. We also have the ability to separate the illumination map from the map that's going to show up in the background, and also the reflection map as well. So you can check these options on if you want to have separate maps. So that way, if you make any modifications to the 32-bit image, and in that case, you normally would have to convert it to a much smaller bit depth, being either 8-bit or sometimes 16-bit you can work with. But in that case, it's not going to work very well for lighting. So then you could have the original unedited image for the illumination map, and then an edited version of possibly a lower bit depth for the environment map. I'm going to increase the exposure and the contrast slightly. And we can see that showing up in the scene. So now when I render, it's going to be very quick. As we can see, it is a much lower quality. So it does appear more pixelated, but it'll be a good fast render while we're working on the scene. And if we can come back and modify it a little later. Now there are some options and things you'll need to pay attention to. I also want to note that I did not copy the grass material onto the ground plane. So it is a good idea just to make sure that all the way to the horizon is rendering with that same material as the procedural. Just to load in the same material, or what you can do, we'll just go ahead and I am going to reopen that scene. And what we want to do is select the ground. We can now open the material summary and drag the material onto that ground material. So now the ground has the same material as the terrain, and you would render from here, just in case you run into a spot that has the terrain not fully showing, and you can see the horizon, so if it's not covering it up. That way, at least the material will carry over. Okay, so now back in the HDRI scene and version, I did forget to turn these options off. So make sure we turn off the panoramic spherical, and I didn't save out before I had loaded in the other version, so that's why that was showing. Automatically, when you're using the environment mapping mode, it does enable a fog and haze. This way you can match a fog value that would be equivalent to the HDRI image. And under effects, you can choose to ignore the atmosphere on the map. So that way, any fog values you set will only affect objects and not the atmospheric map itself. It will not overwrite that. And if you have a ground plane, so that shadows show up onto it, you can map this image onto the ground plane. You can also choose to map the upper hemisphere only if you don't want to map anything other than just the atmospheric elements, and if you're going to be using just an upper atmosphere map that doesn't have a ground. So under the lighting settings, it's automatically put us all the way over to the ambient for the light balance. I'm going to switch over to global ambient mode just for now, and I do want a little bit of an effect on the sunlight. Now the problem right now is the sunlight isn't going to be in the same position as it was before, because the HDRI map is not positioned correctly to where the image or the render was made. So what you can do is change the map offset, the U or the V, to correct that, making sure you keep the horizons set correctly. Instead, I'm going to use kind of a different method, more of a direct method. First, I'm going to go to the Fog and Haze and just remove those settings. But in the main camera view, I'm going to select the sun, turn on Point at Camera, which is automatically going to point that sun at the camera so we can manipulate it within this view and line it up. In the image, we can see where the sun is and where it's going to show up. It looks like there's a little bit of a leftover spot. That's probably just a small cloud. So we'll move the sun over. I'm going to switch to the view coordinate system and just move the sun to match where the sunlight is showing on the image. That's a much quicker way, but if the terrain you still have in the scene, you want to still render with it, then it's better to match up the map rather than readjusting sunlight. I also want to note that the sunlight tab is gone from the atmosphere editor when you're using the environment mapping mode. If you have to, you can switch back to the spectral model to adjust the sunlight that way. Otherwise, in the environment mapping mode, you can just modify the sun. I am going to select the sun, turn off Point at Camera now that it is positioned, and we're not going to have to worry about manipulating it and moving it. So I make a quick render, we'll be able to see the background. Of course, it's a lower quality because of the small pixel resolution used, but it's a good backdrop for the meantime. So now I want to add a terrain to the scene to use our ecosystem on, place objects around. So I'm going to load in just a standard terrain. We're going to switch to the 4 viewport mode, move the terrain to the center of the scene, grab our camera and also move it to the center. You can also select these elements by clicking and dragging a highlight over them. If you don't want to use the layer browser, the object browser, I'm going to go ahead and increase the scale of this terrain a little. And then we can edit the object And what I want to do is just smooth out this terrain. I'm going to reduce the pixel resolution to 256 by 256, go to the Effects tab, and use diffusive erosion, which is going to really smooth out the overall map. I could also use some of the settings. On the left, I could erode it slightly, or use mounds. I'm just going to choose to use diffusive. Clicking and holding down will continually apply the effect, which is what I was just doing, really smoothing it out. Because we have a transition into the ground, to match with the image, what I can do is clip out the bottom just to make sure that none of the square corners are going to be showing. Since it'll be intersecting with the ground plane, that's not really a huge issue. But if I chose to delete the ground, that way you wouldn't have to worry about the different materials showing. Now, I don't have that modified grass material with the color change I made saved out. And since that terrain is no longer in the scene, what I could do is go ahead and just save the scene, go back to the other version, and you can right-click and save a material. You could also just copy it and then paste it into the other scene. That clipboard information will remain in the clipboard between scenes, although saving it and then reloading is probably the best way to go. So I'm just going to load in the original material, make that slight change in the color once again. So it may not match exactly for me, but if you wanted to go back in the other scene, you could easily get that to match up. So I'm going to adjust to the Z scale on this terrain. And we could find a good position around it. And just want to have a few interesting areas of the terrain showing. I could also go ahead and rotate it around a little. And for the most part, that background of the terrain isn't showing very much. It's really being covered. So it's not a huge deal. That's not really showing. I'll switch to the final mode really quick and just render. We can see how quickly it renders, but also the difference between the map and then also the actual geometry that's rendering. So there is a huge difference, so that quality might need to be adjusted. Of course, I did use contrast and exposure on the HDRI, so that is another reason why it's not going to match perfectly. But either way, we've got a fast rendering sky, and then we can make some more modifications to the lighting in other areas of the scene. But for the most part, we've just got something really small that's really rendering, and the rest of it we don't need to worry about. So that way we've got a little bit of a quicker workflow for working on the scene. We can always switch the render mode back to spectral. So I'm just going to save this out, and now we can move on to creating the ecosystem and setting up the trees, and taking a look at some of the more advanced options for ecosystems and also customizing the plants, and just a lot of other neat stuff we can do with the scene.